When the ex-husband and his mistress walked into a party, they never expected to see her, his gorgeous ex-wife. "Hello, my dear friends. How are you all today? I just want to take a moment to say a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you. Your support means the world to me, and it truly warms my heart to know that you appreciate the stories I share. All I ever ask is for your feedback and your kind words in the comments. Your thoughts matter so much to me. Please, take a moment to let me know how you felt about today's story and where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, I'd be so grateful if you could subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing these beautiful, heartwarming tales together. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's story. The night was electric, with the soft hum of conversations, clinking glasses, and the golden glow of chandeliers casting a soft, warm light over the ballroom. The city's elite had gathered for an exclusive gala at one of the most prestigious venues, a place where power, wealth, and influence converged. This was an event where names mattered, where every smile hid a story and every handshake was more than just a formality. The marble floors shimmered beneath the feet of the glittering crowd as they moved with grace and poise. The room was alive with the sound of laughter and murmurs, the music from a live band softly filling the spaces between conversations. The air smelled of expensive perfume, fine wine, and a hint of fresh roses that adorned the tables. At the center of it all, standing tall and exuding an air of confidence, was Daniel Carter. He was a man who had built his empire from the ground up, a successful businessman whose name commanded respect in every boardroom. His dark suit, sharp and tailored to perfection, only enhanced his powerful presence. His deep-set eyes, the color of dark amber, scanned the room with a practiced ease, assessing everything and everyone. He moved with the precision of a man who was used to being in control, a man who had mastered the art of charisma. Clinging to his arm, a stark contrast to Daniel's composed appearance, was Vanessa. She was much younger than him, her bright blonde hair styled in soft waves that cascaded down her back. Her dress, a revealing red gown that hugged her figure in all the right places, shimmered as she walked. She was the epitome of elegance, at least on the surface. Her presence at Daniel's side turned heads, as it always did. Her beauty, combined with the aura of wealth that surrounded her, made her the perfect companion for a man like Daniel. She thrived in the spotlight, basking in the attention that came with being seen with a wealthy, influential businessman. Vanessa smiled, offering a calculated glance to anyone who dared to meet her gaze, her lips painted a bright red. She had mastered the art of the perfect smile, the kind that said, "I am untouchable, and I know it." Her laughter was high-pitched and bubbly, a carefully crafted sound that echoed in the ears of the high society guests who couldn't help but admire her beauty and her poise. Yet as she stood beside Daniel, her hand resting possessively on his arm, there was a flicker of insecurity that occasionally crept into her expression. She tried her best to suppress it, to bury it beneath her perfect facade, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling at the back of her mind. She wasn't just Daniel's companion. She was his current companion. And she knew that this title, in the world of the wealthy and influential, was fleeting. The attention of men like Daniel was always on the move, always looking for the next conquest, the next beautiful woman to stand beside him at the next high-profile event. But tonight, Vanessa would not think about that. Tonight, she had Daniel's arm, and with it, she had the world at her feet. She adjusted her posture, lifting her chin just a fraction higher, making sure her image was perfectly aligned with the high expectations of the crowd around her. Daniel, however, was a man divided. As much as he relished the attention, as much as he appreciated the power and status that came with being seen with someone like Vanessa, his thoughts were elsewhere. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, often drifted from the crowd, moving over the sea of faces as if searching for something or someone. The conversations around him blurred into background noise, muffled by the weight of his thoughts. He had spent months in this new life, wrapped in the luxury of a younger woman's company, focusing on his work, on his business, on the endless cycle of events and social gatherings that had come to define his life. On paper, Daniel was a man who had everything. He had the wealth, the influence, the power to shape the world around him. He had the admiration of his peers, the loyalty of his colleagues, and the desire of countless women who would have loved nothing more than to be in Vanessa's place. But despite all of it, there was something inside of him that refused to settle. He had tried to ignore it, tried to push it deep into the recesses of his mind. After all, what was the point of dwelling on the past when the future was right in front of him, so bright and full of promise? And yet, no matter how many glasses of champagne he downed, no matter how many conversations he engaged in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was her, the one woman who had once owned his heart completely, the one woman who had made him feel whole, the one woman who had made him believe in the possibility of forever. Her absence had left a void in him that no amount of success, no number of beautiful women, no endless nights in the most glamorous venues could fill. It was a void he had ignored for as long as he could. Sophia. Her name whispered in the back of his mind, but he silenced it. The divorce had been a clean break, or so he had told himself. He had convinced himself that he was over her, that moving on was the only thing that mattered. But deep down, he knew that he had never really moved on. He had buried his feelings for her under layers of distractions, under the new life he had built for himself. But they were still there. And as he stood there, his hand lightly resting on Vanessa's, feeling the weight of the room's gaze on him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the past was not as far behind him as he had convinced himself it was. He could still see her in his mind, standing at the end of the aisle, her smile radiant as she walked toward him. He could still hear her laughter, soft and melodic, filling the quiet moments of their life together. He could still feel the way her hand had felt in his, the warmth of her touch, the security in her presence. But that was all gone now. And it was his fault. His infidelity had shattered the foundation of their relationship, and no matter how much time had passed, he knew that he couldn't undo what had been done. It was a fact he had to live with, a mistake that would haunt him forever. As the night continued around him, with guests moving in and out of the ballroom, Daniel's thoughts remained fixed on Sophia. He forced himself to focus on Vanessa's soft laughter, her hand on his arm, the gentle pressure of her body against his. He tried to push the past away, but it clung to him, like an invisible shadow. Vanessa, sensing the shift in his attention, looked up at him. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression. She didn't ask him what he was thinking, but she knew. She always knew when something was off. For the first time, she wondered if she was truly the woman he wanted, or was she just the woman who had come along when the one he truly loved was no longer in reach. As the night wore on, with the music swaying and the champagne flowing, Daniel found himself at a crossroads, unable to escape the pull of his past, even as he tried to keep his gaze fixed firmly on the present. And somewhere, in the midst of the glitz and glamour, the echoes of a past love quietly whispered just beyond his reach. The gala was in full swing, the sounds of chatter and laughter filling the grand ballroom as guests swirled around in a dazzle of evening gowns, tuxedos, and the bright glint of gold and diamonds. Daniel and Vanessa were among them, effortlessly moving through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces, accepting the compliments that came their way. Vanessa, always the center of attention, with her flirtatious charm and radiant smile, kept a firm hold on Daniel's arm, making sure everyone knew who he belonged to. It was a perfect evening, a night of power, status, and control. Yet Daniel's mind wandered, distracted despite the lavish surroundings. His thoughts drifted, but he quickly tried to bring them back to the present. He was here, with Vanessa. He had built a new life after all. He had left his past behind, or so he had convinced himself. It was then that it happened. The hum of the crowd seemed to fade, the air becoming thick with an invisible tension. A hush fell over a section of the room, as if something or someone had just altered the atmosphere in an instant. Conversations slowed to a murmur, and heads began to turn. A ripple of quiet excitement spread through the guests as they stared toward the entrance. The music shifted, as if it too sensed the change in the room. Daniel's attention snapped toward the entrance, his heartbeat inexplicably quickening. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the world around him seemed to blur. There, framed by the golden light of the chandelier above, stood the figure who had once meant everything to him, the woman who had shattered his heart and his world. Sophia. She was a vision, a presence so captivating that it felt as if the room had come to a standstill. The way she stood there, poised and commanding, her gaze calm but intense, was like a force of nature. Her hair, long and flowing, cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and the black gown she wore shimmered under the ballroom lights as if it was spun from stardust. The dress hugged her body, its sleek flowing fabric a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the surroundings. The delicate cutouts along her neckline and the way it accentuated her silhouette made her look like a goddess who had descended into the mortal realm. She was more breathtaking than Daniel remembered. Her beauty was timeless, but it wasn't just her physical appearance that captured the room. It was the aura she exuded. Sophia had always possessed an inner strength, a quiet confidence that could command a room without a word. Now it was even more powerful. She stood with grace and poise, her every movement deliberate, her posture impeccable. She was no longer the woman who had clung to his side with uncertainty, the woman who had been blinded by love. Sophia had transformed. She was no longer the woman who had left their marriage in tears. She was someone new, someone stronger, sharper, and untouchable. She was an independent woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and her presence in the room was undeniable. As she moved through the crowd, people parted effortlessly to make way for her, their eyes following her as if they too were awestruck by the force she carried with her. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes locked on her. Time seemed to slow as he watched Sophia glide through the room, her gaze scanning the crowd, seemingly unaffected by the attention she was receiving. His chest tightened, and a familiar weight settled in his stomach, the kind of heaviness that only the past could bring. His breath hitched in his throat as he tried to grasp the fact that she was here, that she had entered his world once more, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. The memories came rushing back in an instant. The laughter they had shared, the way her hand had felt in his, the late-night talks where they had dreamed together about the future. Those memories were not just distant echoes. They were alive in his mind, vivid and painful. He had buried them under the layers of his new life, under the distractions of his business, his relationships, and his ambition. But they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And this was the moment. He hadn't expected it to hit him like this. He hadn't prepared for the wave of emotion that swept over him, threatening to pull him under. His stomach churned as he took in every detail of Sophia's appearance. Her dark eyes, now brimming with confidence and resolve, scanned the room with an ease he had never seen before. She was no longer the broken woman he had left behind. She had grown, evolved, and, in many ways, left him far behind. Vanessa, still attached to his side, noticed the sudden change in Daniel. She had been chatting with a group of women, but now fell silent as she saw where his eyes were fixed. The tension between them was palpable as she followed his gaze to the entrance. When she saw who it was, a small, almost imperceptible frown tugged at the corner of her lips. "Who is that?" Vanessa's voice was barely above a whisper, a note of curiosity, but there was something else too. Something more calculating, as if she already suspected the answer, but didn't want to believe it. Daniel's lips parted, his throat dry as he tried to form a response. For a moment, he struggled to say her name, as if the words themselves were a betrayal. "That's Sophia," he finally managed to say, his voice quieter than he intended, betraying more emotion than he was ready to admit. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, her grip on his arm tightening. She had been introduced to the world of Daniel's past before, but to see the way his eyes lingered on Sophia, the way his whole demeanor shifted, made her stomach tighten. She didn't say a word, but the smirk that curled at the corners of her mouth told a different story. "Well, she certainly knows how to make an entrance," she said coolly, but her words were laced with a hint of insecurity. Daniel didn't respond. His gaze was still locked on Sophia, who was now greeting a few of the other guests with a calm, practiced smile. His mind raced, filled with regret, longing, and a deep sense of loss that he could no longer deny. Sophia had entered the room like a storm, and in that moment, Daniel realized just how much he had never truly moved on. The past, the woman he had once loved, the woman who had once been his world, it was all there, flooding him once again. The crowd seemed to melt away as Daniel's focus remained solely on Sophia. His heart beat louder, his body tense, and despite the years that had passed, it was as if no time had passed at all. He was back there, with her, in their life, in their shared memories. For a brief, fleeting moment he could almost hear her voice, see her smile, and feel her warmth beside him. But now she was someone else, someone untouchable. Vanessa's grip on Daniel's arm tightened as her sharp eyes caught the slight shift in his posture. She had seen it before. Whenever a woman, a flirtatious glance, or a subtle compliment came Daniel's way, there was always a certain ease to him, a charming confidence that didn't waver. But now something was different. His entire demeanor had changed. His smile had faltered, his gaze frozen in the direction of the entrance where Sophia stood. For a moment, Vanessa felt a jolt of unease race through her, a creeping suspicion that she couldn't shake. She followed Daniel's stare, narrowing her eyes as she looked at the woman who had captivated him so thoroughly. Sophia Bennett, the ex-wife, the one who had a claim to Daniel's past. A claim that Vanessa had never been able to fully dismiss. Her grip on his arm became more possessive, almost to the point of discomfort. "Who is she?" Vanessa's voice, though soft, was tinged with something sharper, more insistent than she had intended. The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in curiosity. She had to know. She had to understand why Daniel, a man who usually held the power to control any room, had suddenly become a mere spectator, paralyzed by a presence he couldn't seem to look away from. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the question Vanessa had asked. He didn't want to answer. He didn't want to acknowledge the woman who had once been everything to him, the woman whose memory still lingered in the deepest corners of his mind. But he had to. He couldn't lie, not to Vanessa, at least not this time. His eyes reluctantly slid away from Sophia and met Vanessa's impatient gaze. "That's Sophia." He hesitated, as if the name itself held too much weight, too much history. "My ex-wife." Vanessa's lips curled into a controlled smile, but the look in her eyes betrayed her. The casual smirk was a thin mask, one that couldn't completely conceal the discomfort twisting inside her. Ex-wife. That word, simple and straightforward, sounded more like a warning shot than anything else. She could feel her heart race, her mind spinning, as she processed what Daniel had just said. Sophia, The name seemed to linger between them, heavy with unsaid things. She knew about Daniel's past, had heard bits and pieces of it, the failed marriage, the divorce, the eventual breakup. But there had always been a certain detachment in Daniel's recounting, a wall he had built around it. Yet now, with Sophia standing across the room, it was clear that the past wasn't as far behind him as he had led her to believe. Vanessa's grip on his arm tightened further, not out of affection, but from a deep sense of possessiveness that flared inside her. She forced herself to laugh, though it felt empty. Well, she certainly knows how to make an entrance. The words came out colder than she intended, but she couldn't help herself. The way Sophia walked into the room, as though the entire gala had been waiting for her, commanded attention in a way Vanessa had never been able to replicate. It was as if the very air had shifted when Sophia entered, and everyone else had just been playing catch-up. Vanessa flipped her hair dismissively, a small, practiced movement that she hoped would signal her indifference, but inside the unease was growing. This woman. She had no idea how she could still have such an effect on Daniel after all these years. What was it about her? The question gnawed at Vanessa, burrowing into her thoughts, demanding answers she didn't have. Daniel, however, remained still. He tried to focus on the conversation at hand, on the people around him, on the festivities, but he couldn't. Not now. Not with Sophia in the room. He tried to push away the thoughts swirling in his mind, the memories of their time together, the tenderness they had shared, the way she had made him feel. It wasn't something he could just switch off. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the way his heart responded to seeing her again. Vanessa, sensing the distance between them, felt a strange combination of anger and fear bubbling inside her. She had never liked the idea of the ex-wife, the ghost of a past that Daniel couldn't seem to bury. But now, seeing the way he looked at Sophia, like she was a part of him that still lingered in the shadows, Vanessa felt something deeper stir inside her. The jealousy was familiar, but it was sharper now, more real than ever before. She cleared her throat, her voice low and tight, masking the insecurity that was beginning to show. Does she always do this? Vanessa's words hung in the air, accusing, as if she were trying to downplay Sophia's entrance, to diminish its effect. She was probing, but in the way that only a woman could, searching for weaknesses, for chinks in the armor Daniel had so carefully constructed. Daniel hesitated, his thoughts a whirlpool of contradictions. He knew Vanessa wanted answers, but how could he explain what was happening inside him? He didn't have a clear answer for himself, let alone her. The only thing that was certain was that seeing Sophia again had broken the dam he had spent months building. The flood of emotions, of regrets, of longing, was now impossible to ignore. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. She doesn't do anything, he said, though it sounded like a feeble attempt at reassurance. It's just, she's always had a way of commanding attention. Vanessa didn't look convinced. Her sharp gaze didn't leave his face, as if she could read every subtle flicker in his expression, every slight change in his body language. She could see it now, the way his eyes were, still drawn to Sophia, how his posture had shifted, how his shoulders had become tense, and she could see the guilt in his eyes, the faintest shadow of something deeper than mere recognition. Sophia had left a mark on him, one that no one else, not even Vanessa, could erase. Vanessa forced a smile, though it felt brittle, as if it might crack at any moment. "Well, I suppose she's the one who got away, huh?" Her voice was laced with sarcasm, masking the growing resentment inside her. Daniel's eyes darted to her, taken aback by the venom in her tone. He didn't know how to respond. not without revealing too much. It wasn't that he didn't care about Vanessa, but in that moment, with Sophia standing across the room like a distant dream, Daniel found himself questioning everything. Had he truly moved on from the woman who had once been his world? Or had he simply buried the truth beneath the weight of new distractions, new commitments? Sophia's presence was like a mirror reflecting the cracks Daniel had hidden away for so long, and Vanessa could see it. She could see the chasm widening between them. She was no longer the only woman in Daniel's life who held any claim to him. There was another one, a powerful one, who would always have a place in his heart. The silence between them thickened, and Vanessa could no longer mask the unease that gnawed at her. She tried to push the feeling aside, to hold on to the control she had always prided herself on, but it was slipping, like sand, through her fingers. The night, once full of promise and excitement, suddenly felt heavy, and Vanessa knew deep down that this was only the beginning of something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Sophia entered the party with an air of grace and poise that turned heads, but there was an underlying strength to her every step. It wasn't just her beauty that commanded attention, it was the transformation that she had undergone over the past few years. As she walked through the room, the whispering chatter seemed to follow her like a trail of curiosity, but Sophia paid no attention. She was no longer the woman defined by her past, by her failed marriage to Daniel. She was someone entirely different now, someone untouchable, unbreakable, and incredibly powerful. Her black gown shimmered in the soft golden light, flowing around her in waves of elegance as she made her way through the sea of people. The fabric clung to her figure just enough to emphasize her transformation, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The soft curves that had once felt burdened by insecurity now radiated confidence. Her face, once a portrait of vulnerability after the divorce, now reflected the strength of a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. As Sophia continued through the crowd, people whispered, "Is that Sophia Bennett, the one who used to be married to Daniel Carter?" Someone asked, their voice filled with awe. The name Sophia Bennett had become more than just a familiar one. It was synonymous with power, ambition, and undeniable success. What had once been the name of a woman associated with heartbreak and betrayal had morphed into a symbol of resilience and accomplishment. She had built her own empire, one that stood on the foundation of hard work, perseverance, and the lessons she had learned from the wreckage of her past. After the divorce, Sophia had taken the pieces of her broken heart and put them to work. She had started her own business, carving out a name for herself in an industry once dominated by men, and within a few short years she had risen to the top. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who no longer needed to be anyone's partner to feel whole. Her independence was her greatest asset, her driving force. Sophia's entrepreneurial journey had not been easy. She had faced resistance at every turn, doubts from colleagues, skepticism from investors, and even ridicule from those who thought a woman couldn't lead in the cutthroat world of business. But Sophia had never backed down. She had fought tooth and nail to build her company, and now she was reaping the rewards of her hard work. Every deal she closed, every new partnership she formed, was a reminder of how far she had come. She had emerged from the ashes of her divorce stronger than ever before. The pain from the betrayal had cut deep, and the scars were still there, hidden beneath the surface. When Daniel's infidelity had been uncovered, Sophia had been devastated. It wasn't just the affair itself. It was the feeling of being unimportant, unseen, and betrayed by someone she had loved deeply. The years they had spent together had meant everything to her, and to find out that he had been with someone else, That he had chosen to lie to her had shattered the trust she had placed in him. For a while, Sophia had been lost. She had fallen into a deep sadness, questioning her worth, wondering what she had done wrong. The divorce had nearly broken her. The woman who had once believed in the power of love and loyalty had been forced to confront the harsh reality of betrayal. But rather than allow herself to be consumed by bitterness, she had made a conscious decision to rebuild, not just her life, but herself. Sophia had spent months soul-searching, rediscovering who she was outside of her marriage. She had thrown herself into her work, found solace in her friendships, and embraced her independence. Slowly but surely, she had learned to trust herself again, and over time, she had become someone entirely new. She no longer saw herself as the woman who had been left behind, no longer the woman who had waited for Daniel to come home, to pay attention, to show her love. She was no longer the woman who had clung to a love that had withered. She had learned to love herself, to embrace her strengths and flaws, and to trust in her own capabilities. As she mingled with the crowd, Sophia was unaware of the impact her presence had on those around her. She wasn't looking for approval, nor did she need it. She had long since learned that validation came from within, and no one could define her worth but herself. Her ex-husband, Daniel, would soon learn that the woman he had once taken for granted was now a force far beyond his reach. The life they had shared was a part of her past, a chapter that had closed, leaving her open to new possibilities, new horizons. Sophia had become the epitome of a woman who had found her voice, her power. It was evident in the way she carried herself, in the confidence with which she spoke, and in the way she interacted with the people around her. Where once she had been soft-spoken, hesitant, and uncertain of herself, now she stood tall, exuding an air of command that was impossible to ignore. As she approached the bar, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces. Old friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Her gaze briefly met Daniel's, but she didn't look away or shy from the encounter. Instead, she held his gaze with a calm, collected confidence, the same kind of composure that had taken her years to cultivate. She didn't need to make a scene or demand attention. The years of healing had taught her that the most powerful statement she could make was to simply be herself. Daniel, for all his success and wealth, was nothing compared to the woman she had become. She had learned that life wasn't about what you had, it was about what you did with what you were given. And she had made something extraordinary out of her second chance at life. Sophia felt no bitterness toward Daniel. She had long since released the pain he had caused her. The past was the past, and there was no turning back. The life she had built in his absence was one that she was proud of, one that was filled with purpose, ambition, and the kind of love that she had learned to give herself. She wasn't angry. She was free. As she stood there, in the center of it all, Sophia was the embodiment of a woman who had taken her broken pieces and turned them into a masterpiece. She was a testament to resilience, a living example of how a woman could rise from the ashes of her past and create a future beyond her wildest dreams. The air seemed to thicken around Daniel and Sophia as they found themselves standing mere feet away from each other near the bar. The bustling sounds of the gala faded into the background as the weight of the past filled the space between them. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to stretch, like the universe had frozen just to allow them this one painful encounter. Daniel's heart raced in his chest, his breath shallow as his mind struggled to find the right words, but there was nothing he could say that could erase the years of mistakes, the hurts, and the misunderstandings. He had spent months preparing for this moment, convincing himself that he had moved on, that Sophia was a chapter of his life that had long been closed. But now, with her standing in front of him, so beautiful, so composed, all of his carefully constructed walls came crashing down in an instant. He could feel his hands trembling, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say to her after everything that had happened? After the lies, the infidelity, the betrayal? Could he apologize in a way that would make up for all the years he had taken her for granted? The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, wrapping around them like a heavy fog. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Daniel managed to speak, his voice quieter than he had intended. Sophia. The single word hung in the air between them, and Sophia's eyes flickered toward him. There was no warmth in her gaze, no sign of the woman who had once loved him with her entire being. She had long since stopped expecting anything from him, long since stopped hoping for apologies that would never come. But she didn't look at him with the bitterness she might have once held. Instead, she offered a smile, polite, controlled, but one that never quite reached her eyes. "Daniel," she replied simply, her tone neutral, distant. She didn't need to say anything else. The weight of the years between them was enough. Sophia didn't let herself be swallowed by the past. She had worked hard to come to terms with her emotions and had done everything she could to heal from the pain of their divorce. She had built a life for herself, one where Daniel no longer had any hold over her heart, but standing here in front of him, the man who had once been her everything, reminded her of just how much she had lost. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the person she had been before all of it. She couldn't ignore the pang of sadness, the small ache in her chest, as she realized how much she had given to him, only to be discarded. Before she could say anything further, Vanessa, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward. Her presence was impossible to ignore. She was radiant, her blonde hair flowing perfectly, her makeup flawless, and her dress, though less sophisticated than Sophia's, still alluring in its own right. She stood beside Daniel, her grip on his arm tightening in a way that spoke volumes. There was a subtle tension in her posture, her gaze lingering on Sophia as though trying to assess her. Vanessa cleared her throat loudly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I don't believe we've met," she said, her tone cordial but tinged with something more, something that could easily be described as possessiveness. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her nails painted a sharp red, as though marking her territory. "I'm Vanessa." Sophia regarded the hand with a brief hesitation, then shifted her gaze back to Daniel, catching the faintest flicker of discomfort in his expression. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the confident, businesslike exterior that he always wore in public. But for that brief moment, she could see that he wasn't as unaffected as he would have liked to appear. Sophia turned her attention back to Vanessa, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She didn't allow herself to feel threatened. She had long since made peace with the fact that Daniel had moved on. She wasn't here to compete with his new relationship, nor did she want to. There was no place for jealousy in the life she had carefully built. Vanessa's hand remained extended, and after a brief moment, Sophia, ever the poised woman, reached out to shake it. The two women's hands met, and for a fleeting second, Sophia couldn't help but notice the contrast between them. Vanessa's hand was soft and warm, but it lacked the strength that Sophia had learned to develop over the years. There was a confidence in her own touch, a calmness that came from knowing her worth. "Sophia," she said smoothly, her voice even, though there was an unmistakable undertone of something more. It wasn't malice, but it wasn't the cheery, warm greeting that might have come from someone who didn't know the history between them. It was the voice of a woman who had lived through the storm, who had learned to navigate the complexities of life and relationships. "It's nice to meet you." The words were polite, but the meaning behind them was far deeper. Sophia didn't need to say anything else. She knew exactly what Vanessa was trying to prove, and she didn't have to engage. She wasn't there to start a fight, nor to engage in a battle over Daniel. That was a war she had already fought, and won, when she had walked away from him. For a moment, the three of them stood there, an uncomfortable triangle, each person unsure of the next move. Daniel looked between the two women, his mind racing, but there was nothing he could say. The silence hung in the air once again, this time more oppressive than before. His past was standing before him, a ghost he could no longer run from. Sophia, on the other hand, wasn't bothered by the tension. She had grown accustomed to standing tall in the face of discomfort. She had learned that some moments didn't require explanations or actions. They simply required presence. "I should go," Sophia said, her voice steady and calm as she slowly withdrew her hand from Vanessa's grasp. She wasn't running from the situation, but there was nothing more for her to say. She had long since realized that there were some things in life, like relationships, like love, that weren't meant to be forced or fixed, not anymore. Vanessa watched her go, a tight smile playing on her lips, but the unsettling feeling in her chest remained. She couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this moment, had revealed something she hadn't anticipated. Sophia walked away from the bar, her steps graceful and sure, the silence of the night falling around her once again. As she made her way through the crowd, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something, a sense of closure, perhaps. She had never expected to be in this position, standing face to face with Daniel after all this time. But here she was, calm and collected, no longer the woman who had once begged for his attention. She had already moved on. As the evening wore on, the lively atmosphere of the gala began to blur into the background for Daniel. The conversations around him became distant murmurs, the clink of glasses faded into nothingness, and the laughter of the guests, once so inviting, became little more than a low hum in his ears. His focus was entirely consumed by one thing, Sophia. Even as he stood beside Vanessa, his mind was elsewhere. He tried to force himself to be present, to engage with the people around him, but his thoughts kept pulling him back to the past, back to a time when everything had been simpler, when he had been happy, when he had felt whole. He remembered the way Sophia used to smile at him, the way her laughter had filled their home, how she had loved him with a depth he had never known could exist. There had been a warmth in her eyes that he hadn't appreciated back then. The late-night talks they had shared about everything and nothing at all. Those moments had been so ordinary, so simple, but looking back now, they felt like treasures. The way they had been a team working side by side, growing together, he had taken that for granted. His mind wandered back to their wedding day, the promises they had made to one another, their hands intertwined as they had vowed to love each other for the rest of their lives. He had believed it then, believed that nothing could ever tear them apart. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped trying. He had stopped putting in the effort. He had allowed the pressures of work, the distractions of life, and his own selfishness to push her away. He had taken her love for granted, assuming she would always be there, never imagining that his actions, his neglect, would one day drive her away. By the time he realized his mistake, it had been too late. Sophia had already made up her mind. The betrayal had broken something inside her, and no matter how much he begged or apologized, it wasn't enough to repair the damage. She had walked away, leaving him with nothing but his regret. Daniel let out a long, slow breath, trying to shake off the memory, but it clung to him like a heavy fog, clouding his thoughts. His gaze inadvertently drifted back to the spot where Sophia had been earlier. She was no longer there, but the image of her standing in front of him, so confident, so composed, lingered in his mind. She had looked nothing like the woman he had known, the woman who had once been so vulnerable, so full of love for him. She had transformed into someone entirely different, someone strong, someone unshakable. His heart twisted with a mix of admiration and regret. He had watched her grow, not from a distance, but with the painful awareness that he had played a part in shaping the woman she'd become. The realization hit him hard. Sophia was no longer the woman he had married, but someone far stronger, far more resilient than he could have ever imagined. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt the most was that he was no longer the man who deserved her. Daniel's grip on his glass tightened, his knuckles turning white as the reality of it all sunk in. He wasn't sure where the path had gone wrong, but it was clear to him now that he'd made a choice long ago, one he regretted every single day since. He had chosen his career, his ambition, over the woman he had once promised the world to, and now, years later, it was too late to undo the damage. Vanessa's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and impatient, like a splash of cold water. "Daniel, stop staring," she snapped, her voice cutting through the haze of his memories. "She's your past. I'm your present." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He blinked, snapping out of the trance he had fallen into. Vanessa's expression was one of irritation, her brow furrowed in annoyance as she crossed her arms over her chest. Daniel's stomach twisted, guilt settling over him like a heavy weight. He didn't want to hurt her, but how could he explain the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling? He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. In that moment, everything felt so confusing. Vanessa's presence was comforting, but it wasn't enough. He could sense the distance growing between them, and it wasn't because of anything she had done. It was because of the deep ache in his chest, the longing for something he could never have again. "I'm not staring," Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, trying to dismiss the feelings that were rushing back to him. "I'm just thinking." Vanessa didn't seem convinced. "Well, whatever you're thinking about is not me," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing as she glared at him. "You've been in your own world all night, and I'm getting tired of it." Daniel felt a pang of frustration. He hadn't wanted to hurt her, but the more he tried to focus on the present, the more the past seemed to drag him back. He didn't want to be with Vanessa out of obligation. He didn't want to stay in this relationship because it was easier than facing the truth of his own failure. He wanted something real, something genuine, something that had been lost when he had pushed Sophia away, but he wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. Sophia had moved on. She was no longer the woman he had known. And now, so much time had passed that he wasn't even sure if he could be the man she needed him to be. Vanessa's voice brought him back to reality once again. "Daniel," she said, her tone dripping with frustration. "You've got to stop looking at her. She's your past. I'm your present. Remember that." But Daniel wasn't so sure anymore. He wanted to agree with her. He wanted to turn his back on the past and embrace the present. But every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was Sophia's face, the face of the woman who had once loved him so completely, the face of the woman he had lost. Sophia stood alone for a moment, her champagne glass in hand as she surveyed the party from a distance. The sounds of the gala filled the air, but to her, everything felt muted. She had spent years building a life for herself, creating a world where she no longer needed Daniel. It had taken time, but she'd learned to stand on her own 2 feet. The pain of their divorce was still a shadow in the back of her mind, but she had grown accustomed to its presence. It no longer consumed her. Yet tonight, seeing him again, seeing Daniel in the flesh for the first time in so long, had stirred something inside her that she hadn't anticipated. She had moved on. She had to. But that didn't mean she had stopped feeling. Feelings, after all, weren't something you could turn off with the flip of a switch. Sophia took another sip of her champagne, her gaze drifting back to Daniel, who was across the room with his girlfriend Vanessa. He looked different now, more mature, more refined. But in his eyes, she saw the same man she had once loved with all her heart, the man who had broken her. Her mind replayed the painful memories, the late-night arguments, the hollow promises, and the silence that had taken over their home before they finally called it quits. He had betrayed her trust, and no matter how much she had loved him, love couldn't undo that. It couldn't erase the hurt he had caused, and yet a part of her couldn't help but wonder if he'd changed. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, an old friend of hers, Grace, approached with a warm smile. Grace had known Sophia long before the divorce, and their friendship had been a constant throughout the years. She had seen Sophia at her lowest, and had been there for her when she needed someone to lean on. "I see you're still keeping your distance from him," Grace remarked, her eyes following Sophia's gaze toward Daniel. Sophia didn't respond right away, instead taking another sip of her drink. She didn't want to admit it, but the truth was she had been watching him all night. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to face. Grace raised an eyebrow, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You still have feelings for him, don't you?" The question hit Sophia like a jolt of electricity. She hadn't expected to hear it out loud. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly masked her surprise with a calm expression. Sophia sighed deeply, lowering her gaze to the champagne glass in her hand. The words came out slow, deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing them. "Feelings aren't something you can switch off, Grace," she said softly, almost to herself. "You can try to bury them, pretend they don't exist, but they linger." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass absently. "But love isn't enough without respect and trust." Her voice was steady, but the pain behind the words was undeniable. Sophia had learned that the hard way. Love could make you blind. It could make you forgive things you shouldn't, but without respect and trust, love couldn't survive. Grace nodded, her expression softening with understanding. She knew all too well the toll that Daniel's betrayal had taken on her friend. "I know," she said quietly, "but what if he regrets it? What if he's changed?" Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat at the thought. She turned her gaze toward Daniel again, her mind racing. What if he had changed? What if all this time he had spent reflecting on his mistakes, realizing the depth of his wrongs? What if he had come to see her the way she had once seen him, a man she trusted, a man she believed in? For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a warmth that spread through her chest. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, walls strong enough to protect her from the pain of the past. But now, in this moment, the walls seemed to be crumbling. Sophia looked back at Grace, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I spent so long moving on, building a life without him. I had to. There was no other choice." She looked down at her glass again, trying to steady herself, but now Seeing him like this, I can't help but wonder—" She trailed off, her words unfinished, as if she were afraid to say them out loud. Grace, sensing her friend's internal struggle, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Sophia. I know you've been through so much, but just be honest with yourself. Ask yourself what you really want." Sophia swallowed hard, trying to suppress the emotions that had begun to rise inside her. The question Grace had asked wasn't so simple. What did she want? Was she willing to open herself up to the possibility of reconciliation, or was she better off leaving the past where it belonged, behind her? She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened, the love she had lost, the trust she had given, and the heartache that had followed. It wasn't easy, but she had come to a place where she could stand on her own. She had built a life without Daniel, and it had been enough. But now, in the presence of his gaze, his silent apology, and the deep regret she could see in his eyes, she felt the old wounds reopen. The pain was still there, buried beneath years of healing, but it was undeniable. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him. She wasn't sure if she could trust him again. But what if, just maybe, he had changed? What if there was still a chance for them? Sophia's mind raced, and her heart ached with the realization that the past wasn't so easily forgotten, and perhaps it was time to confront it once and for all. The party continued to swirl around them, the chatter, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all mingling into one indistinguishable hum. But for Daniel, it felt like a distant noise, muffled by the storm of thoughts raging in his head. He had tried so hard to put the past behind him. He had convinced himself that Vanessa was the woman he wanted now. She was beautiful, successful, and completely captivated by him. She was everything he thought he needed, yet every time his gaze drifted to Sophia across the room, that old feeling returned. It was like a magnet pulling him toward her, a force he couldn't resist. He watched as she moved gracefully through the crowd, laughing with friends, looking every bit the woman she had become since their divorce. She was more than just his ex-wife now. She was a woman who had risen from the ashes of their failed marriage, stronger and more confident than ever. Vanessa, however, noticed the way his attention seemed glued to Sophia. She saw the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his face softened when he watched her, and a gnawing feeling of insecurity began to grow inside her. She tried to ignore it at first, but the more she watched, the more the jealousy crept in. After what felt like an eternity, Vanessa couldn't take it anymore. She had been silent for as long as she could, but the resentment was bubbling up, threatening to spill over. Without warning, she grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him away from the crowd, her grip tight and insistent. Daniel was taken aback by her sudden forcefulness, but before he could protest, she was dragging him out onto the terrace, away from the prying eyes of the party. The night air was crisp, and the view of the city lights stretched out before them, but it was the tension between them that felt suffocating. Vanessa spun around to face him, her eyes blazing with fury. "What's going on, Daniel?" she demanded, her voice low but seething with anger. "Why can't you stop looking at her?" Daniel blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the intensity of her question. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain that it wasn't what she thought, that it was just a momentary lapse, nothing more. But the words wouldn't come. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, suffocating him, and he knew it. Vanessa's patience wore thin, her eyes narrowing as she took a step closer. "Don't lie to me, Daniel. I know what I saw. You're still in love with her, aren't you?" The accusation stung, but it wasn't untrue. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but the silence between them spoke louder than any explanation could. He had always been good at hiding his feelings, at pretending everything was fine, but now, in this moment, it felt impossible. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until it was almost unbearable. Vanessa's eyes flashed with anger, her frustration boiling over. She threw her hands up in exasperation. "I won't be second to a ghost, Daniel," she spat, her voice sharp and bitter. "I won't be some consolation prize for someone who can't get over his past." Her words hit him like a slap. He felt the sting of her words, but they didn't shock him. Deep down, he knew she was right. The truth had been gnawing at him all night, but he had been too afraid to admit it, even to himself. He had never truly moved on from Sophia. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, to reassure her, to fix what was happening between them. But the reality was, there was nothing he could say. Words felt hollow. Vanessa's face twisted in disgust as she turned on her heel, walking away from him with purposeful strides. Her heels clicked sharply on the stone terrace as she moved toward the door, her back stiff with anger. Daniel watched her leave, his heart sinking with the weight of her departure. He had seen it coming, hadn't he? He had known this moment would arrive eventually. Vanessa wasn't the type of woman to tolerate being second in anyone's life, least of all to an ex-wife who still seemed to have some hold over him. As she stormed off, Daniel stood there, frozen in place, his mind racing. He didn't call out to her. He didn't chase after her. Instead, he let her go. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't holding on to her because he loved her. He wasn't holding on to anything, really. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about something else, something deeper, something he had been unwilling to face. Sophia's face flashed before his eyes again, her smile, her laugh, the way she had once loved him so completely. He had taken it all for granted. He had pushed her away. And now, standing on the terrace, the realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had never truly moved on from her. He had tried to fill the void with someone else, but it wasn't the same. It never would be. Daniel leaned against the railing, staring out at the city below, the lights blurring in his vision. He had wanted to move on, to build a new life, but it was clear now that he hadn't. He had just been lying to himself. Vanessa was right. He was still in love with Sophia, and the silence he had offered her in response had been all the confirmation she needed. He had tried to move on, but he hadn't. The question now was, what would he do about it? The night had settled into a quiet lull, the sounds of the bustling party now distant and faint. The warm glow of the chandeliers inside seemed like a world away, and all that remained was the cold, crisp air of the garden. The city lights twinkled like stars in the distance, but Daniel barely noticed them. His gaze was fixed ahead, searching for the woman he had failed, the woman he once loved with everything he had, Sophia. He had found her, standing alone under the soft glow of a garden lantern, her posture graceful yet weary. She was gazing out into the distance, lost in her thoughts, completely unaware of him approaching. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He had been so sure of himself earlier in the evening, but now, as he watched her from a distance, a deep sense of regret flooded over him. The weight of his actions, of his choices, was heavier than he had ever imagined. He had been living in denial for so long, pretending that he was fine, that he was over her. But the truth was undeniable now. He'd never stopped loving Sophia. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and finally moved toward her. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly become unsteady. When he reached her, he didn't speak at first. He simply stood there a few feet away, waiting for her to notice him. Sophia felt the shift in the air before she heard him. Her body tensed, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as a familiar presence lingered near. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time in years, something flickered behind her composed exterior. It was a brief flash, something soft, something almost tender, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a calm indifference. Daniel swallowed hard, the words he had rehearsed in his mind feeling inadequate now that he was face to face with her. "Sophia," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't expected. It wasn't the confident, assured tone he'd once used when speaking to her. This was different. There was vulnerability in his voice, something raw and unrefined. Sophia's brow furrowed slightly, her gaze narrowing as she took him in. The way he stood before her, his shoulders tense, his posture uncertain, was a stark contrast to the man she had once known. "Shouldn't you be with your date?" she asked, her voice a cool, measured tone that betrayed none of the turmoil she felt inside. Daniel's heart sank at her words. She had every right to ask that question. He could see it in her eyes, the way she had built walls around herself, walls he had once been able to tear down with just a word, a touch. He had shattered those walls, and now they were impenetrable. "She left," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, "because she saw what I was too afraid to admit. I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with years of unspoken emotions. For a long moment, there was silence. Sophia's eyes flickered, and Daniel could see the way her chest rose and fell, as though she was struggling to maintain her composure. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she turned her gaze away, staring out into the garden, her expression unreadable. Sophia's heart clenched at his confession, but she forced herself to remain composed. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be. She had heard these words before, promises, declarations, apologies, and they had all proven to be empty. Love, she had learned the hard way, wasn't just about words. She looked at him then, her eyes hardening, though there was still a trace of something in her gaze, something that spoke of the woman she had once been, the woman who had believed in him. But she had learned, in the years since their divorce, that love wasn't the only thing that mattered. Trust mattered, respect mattered, and Daniel had broken both. "Love isn't just words, Daniel," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "You broke my trust. You shattered it when you chose her over me." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. She was right. He had broken her heart in ways that couldn't be fixed with apologies. He had taken her love for granted, and now, standing before her, he realized just how deeply he had hurt her. "I know," he said, his voice raw, almost hoarse. He took a step closer to her, the space between them growing smaller with each passing second. His heart was pounding in his chest, the weight of his regret pressing down on him like an anchor. "And I would give anything to fix it." Sophia's gaze flickered briefly toward him, but she didn't move. She didn't reach for him, didn't step toward him. She remained perfectly still, her arms crossed, a guarded stance that revealed just how much distance had grown between them. She had spent so long rebuilding herself, learning to trust again, learning to live without him, and yet in this moment she could feel the stirrings of something she thought she had buried, something that had never truly gone away. "You can't fix what's been broken, Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, though she quickly masked it with a steely resolve. "Not with words, not with promises. You had your chance, and you lost it." The words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat, the sting of regret, of loss, tightening in his chest. He had lost her once, and now he could feel her slipping further away. "I know," he whispered again, his voice barely audible. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking her to take him back. He just needed her to understand. He had learned, finally, what he had lost, and he would carry that with him for the rest of his life. Sophia looked at him, her eyes softening for a brief moment before the walls went up again. She took a slow breath and gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Then you'll have to live with it, Daniel. You'll have to live with what you lost, just like I've had to." Daniel stood there, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He had no idea what the future held, or if there was any hope of redemption. All he knew was that he had failed her, and that would be something he would have to live with too. But as he stood there, staring at the woman he once loved, a part of him still held onto the hope that maybe, just maybe, time could heal what had been broken. The garden felt like a world apart from the noisy gala inside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft, silver glow on the two figures standing apart, yet bound by a history that neither of them could escape. Daniel's words had hung in the air between them, hanging like a question neither could answer. Sophia studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched him. She had heard this kind of thing before, words that promised change, promises of redemption that were often hollow and empty. The last time Daniel had stood in front of her, his eyes had been full of empty apologies, promising to do better. But the truth had been revealed when it mattered most, and she had been left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. Now, here he was again, asking for another chance. But this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't the same man who had lied and broken her trust all those years ago. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a rawness in his eyes that spoke of someone who had been through something, someone who had suffered, who had learned from the pain he had caused. Sophia crossed her arms over her chest, taking a deep breath. "People don't change overnight, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. She couldn't afford to let him think that this would be just like the last time. Daniel stood still, his gaze fixed on hers. He understood her hesitation. He had no right to ask for forgiveness, no right to expect her to believe that he was a different man. The words felt like they were stuck in his throat, but he pushed them out anyway. "I don't expect you to take me back," he said, his voice low, earnest. "But I'd like to prove to you that I've changed. Not for you, but because losing you made me realize the kind of man I had become." Sophia's eyes flickered, the smallest hint of something softer moving through them, but she didn't show it. She could feel the sincerity in his words, but that didn't mean she was ready to trust him again. Not after everything that had happened, not after everything he had done. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a small step back, her gaze never leaving his. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the pleading look that reminded her of who he used to be, before everything fell apart. But there was something else there now. It was a quiet kind of sadness that spoke of regret. Sophia felt her heart twist at the thought. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she had moved on, that she was better off without him. But hearing him say those words, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes, made her question everything she thought she knew. Could people really change? Could he really be different? Her mind raced with the memories, the late nights, the broken promises, the way he had broken her trust without a second thought. She had spent years building herself back up after their divorce. She had learned how to be independent, how to stand on her own 2 feet without needing him. But there was a part of her, deep down, that still ached for the man he used to be, for the love they had shared. Sophia met his gaze again, her expression unreadable. "You think you've changed because of me?" she asked, her voice steady, though it held a quiet intensity. "You think that losing me was the wake-up call you needed to figure out who you really are?" Daniel hesitated. "I know it sounds selfish," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's true. I took you for granted. I thought I could live without you, that I could be fine without having you in my life. But I was wrong. Losing you has been the hardest thing I've ever faced. And the pain, it made me look at myself, at the man I had become, and I didn't like what I saw." Sophia was silent for a long moment. She wanted to hate him, to turn away and walk out of his life for good. But the words he spoke, the honesty in his voice, made it impossible for her to do so easily. She had spent so long rebuilding, so long convincing herself that she didn't need him anymore, but part of her, despite everything, still missed him, still missed the man who had once promised to be her everything. "You want me to believe that you've changed," she said finally, her tone softening just a little. "But words are just words, Daniel. They don't mean anything if there's no action behind them." Daniel nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I know. I know I've said things before and I've broken those promises, but this time, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm asking you to let me prove that I've learned, that I've changed. But it's not just about you. It's about me, too. I've spent too many years blaming you, blaming everything except the fact that I was the one who let you go. I've spent too many years hiding from the truth." Sophia looked at him, her heart still aching with the memory of the love they had once shared. But she was older now, wiser. She knew better than to let his words cloud her judgment. Trust wasn't something that could be given so freely. Trust had to be earned, and Daniel had a long way to go before he could even begin to earn that back. "I don't know if you can prove it, Daniel," she said quietly. "I don't know if you can change the past. I don't know if you can make me believe that this time is different." The words hung in the air between them, both a question and an answer. Daniel's chest tightened, but he didn't turn away. He had lost her once, and he couldn't afford to lose her again. He had no right to ask for anything more, but he couldn't stop himself from hoping that somehow she might find it in herself to give him a chance. "Then let me show you," he said softly, his voice steady, but filled with an earnestness that was impossible to ignore. "Let me prove it, Sophia. Let me show you that I can be the man you once believed in." Sophia didn't respond immediately. She stood there for a long time, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She had been hurt so badly, betrayed by the man she had trusted more than anyone else. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, something that spoke of true regret, of a change that he had fought hard for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophia sighed, her breath shaky. She didn't know what would come of this. She didn't know if she could ever fully trust him again. But something in her, something deep down, told her that she needed to give him a chance. "I don't know if I can believe you yet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm willing to see if you can prove it." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't expect her to forgive him, but the fact that she was willing to give him the chance to prove himself meant everything. He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'll show you, Sophia. I'll show you I'm not the same man I was before. I'll prove it, if you'll let me." And for the first time in a long time, Sophia allowed herself to hope just a little, that maybe, just maybe, people could change. The days that followed were a slow, delicate process. each one marked by the subtle shift from old patterns to new possibilities. Daniel didn't rush, didn't demand anything from Sophia. He knew that if he truly wanted to prove himself, it wouldn't be through grand gestures or flashy displays of wealth. He couldn't buy her trust. He couldn't win back her love with lavish gifts or empty promises. What he could offer was consistency. Every morning, he sent her a text, a simple, unassuming message asking how her day was, showing that he cared without overwhelming her. When they ran into each other at social events, he kept a respectful distance, never trying to draw attention to the fact that they were slowly rebuilding their bond. He respected her space, her need for time, and he never once pressured her to take a step forward before she was ready. Daniel knew this wasn't something he could rush. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired. But he was patient, more patient than he had ever been in his life. He didn't push her into conversations about the past. Instead, he listened, truly listened when she spoke. When she shared her thoughts or her dreams, Daniel didn't interrupt or offer his own opinion unless she asked. He took responsibility for his mistakes without excuses, but he also allowed her the time and space to process everything. There were moments when he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a trace of the woman she had been when they first fell in love. But every time he felt that glimmer, he reminded himself to stay humble, to be patient, to not assume anything. Sophia, for her part, took tentative steps of her own. It wasn't easy. The years of hurt, the trust that had been shattered, were heavy burdens to carry. But she was no longer the woman who had been so desperate for Daniel's love and approval. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, and though the pieces of her heart still ached, she no longer needed him to fill the void. She had learned to find happiness within herself, to cultivate her own sense of worth and confidence. And yet, there were moments, quiet moments, when she would catch herself thinking about what might have been if Daniel had never betrayed her. But these thoughts were no longer as sharp as they once were. The pain, though still present, was no longer consuming her. It had softened over time, like a bruise that had healed but left a scar. She allowed herself to forgive him, not for his sake, but for her own. She knew that holding on to the bitterness of the past would only poison her future. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but it did mean freeing herself from the weight of resentment. It meant opening her heart just enough to allow for the possibility that the man who had once hurt her might truly have changed. But forgiveness didn't mean rushing back into his arms. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. Instead, Sophia chose to focus on her own growth. She poured herself into her business, into her passions. She surrounded herself with friends who supported her, with people who understood her worth. And in the quiet moments, when she found herself thinking about Daniel, she didn't feel the same anger she once did. Instead, there was an odd sense of peace, as if she had made her peace with the past, even if she couldn't yet make peace with him. There were small, unspoken victories between them, a shared glance here, a soft smile there. He was always respectful, always there when she needed him, but never too intrusive. He let her decide when she was ready to talk more deeply, when she was ready to open up about the things they had left unsaid. One evening, they found themselves at a mutual friends gathering, the tension between them almost non-existent. Daniel was standing across the room, talking to a group of guests, but his eyes kept returning to Sophia. There was no urgency in his gaze anymore, no desperation for her to notice him. He was content to let her be, content to let the moment unfold as it would. Sophia, in turn, found herself watching him too. She noticed the subtle changes in him, the way he no longer seemed driven by his ego, the way he took responsibility for his actions without looking for approval. She was beginning to see the man he was now, not the man he had been when he hurt her. And in seeing him, in truly seeing him, she began to wonder if there was still a place for him in her life, but for now, There was no rush. They were both different people from who they had been when they first met. Their love, if it ever returned, would not be the same as it once was. It would be stronger, tempered by time and experience. But Sophia wasn't sure yet what that future might look like. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let her heart love him again. Yet, as the night went on, as she found herself laughing and talking with friends, she realized that she was no longer scared of the future. She wasn't scared of what might happen between her and Daniel. She wasn't scared of opening her heart again, at least not in the way she had been before. Perhaps in time she would be able to give him another chance, but that was something only the future could tell. For now she was content to simply take things one day at a time. The past no longer had the same power over her, and in letting go of her fear, she felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. Daniel, too, was learning to let go. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he was willing to wait. He knew that for now, the only thing he could do was continue to show Sophia that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had broken her trust, and he was willing to wait for as long as it took to prove it to her. And so, with each passing day, they moved forward, slowly, carefully but surely, toward a future that was unwritten, toward a new chapter that neither of them could fully predict. But whatever that future held, they both knew that it would be built on the foundation of honesty, patience, and the quiet hope that love, in its own time, might find its way back to them. Months had passed, and yet there they were, standing in the same garden where so many memories had been made. The air around them felt lighter, less charged with the tension of the past, yet still there was something electric between them, something that hadn't quite faded. The path they had walked to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt, pain, and fear. But now, standing before each other, there was an undeniable change in the air. Sophia stood in the same garden that had once been a symbol of her broken heart. But now, it felt different. The flowers, once wilting under the weight of her sorrow, were now in full bloom, as though reflecting her own rebirth. The garden, once a quiet place of loneliness, now seemed like a new beginning, a space where growth was not only possible but inevitable. She felt it in the air, in the warmth of the sun on her face, and in the way her heart had softened toward Daniel. She looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time in what felt like ages, she saw not just the man who had broken her heart, but the man he had become. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the sincerity that had replaced the arrogance that had once defined him. The way he was standing, waiting patiently for her, spoke volumes. Gone was the man who had been so sure of himself, the man who had betrayed her trust. In his place stood someone else, a man who had worked hard to earn back her respect, a man who had shown, through actions and not just words, that he was capable of growth. Sophia's heart fluttered, but this time it wasn't with the anxiety or fear she had once felt in his presence. No, this time it was a soft, quiet flutter, one that acknowledged the bond they still shared, even if it had been broken for so long. She had spent so many months rebuilding herself, learning to find happiness within herself again, and now, as she stood here with Daniel, she felt like a woman who had lived a lifetime in the span of a few short years. But despite everything, despite the healing and the change, there was still uncertainty. She didn't know where this would go. She didn't know if she was ready to fully let go of the past or to trust him with her heart once more. She had learned to love herself again, to find strength in her independence. She had worked so hard to reclaim her life, to move on from the pain. And yet standing here with him, the temptation to fall back into the comfort of their shared history was strong. "I don't know where this will go," she admitted softly, her voice carrying the weight of her thoughts. She wasn't looking for promises from him, but the uncertainty hung in the air between them, unspoken yet undeniable. It was as if she was testing the waters, allowing herself to acknowledge the possibility of something between them without fully diving in. Daniel heard the hesitation in her voice, but instead of being discouraged, he simply smiled. It wasn't the confident smile he had once worn, the one that tried to mask the pain and regret he had carried for so long. No, this smile was different. It was gentle, sincere, full of understanding. He reached for her hand, his touch light but sure, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that still connected them despite everything. "Then let's write our own ending. Together," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. His words weren't a demand, a plea, or even a promise. They were an invitation to create something new, something they both could shape together. He wasn't asking her to forget the past, nor was he asking for her forgiveness. What he was offering was a chance to move forward, to let the past stay where it belonged and focus on the future they could build. Sophia looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the warmth of his touch seep into her skin. She had spent so long rejecting the idea of love, afraid that it would only lead to more pain, more heartache. She had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was strong enough on her own. But now, standing here with Daniel, she felt a part of herself that had been dormant for so long stir awake. For the first time in a long time, she didn't resist. She didn't pull away from the possibility of something new, something beautiful. She didn't let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she let herself smile back at him, the smile that had been hidden behind layers of doubt and anger, the smile that had been buried under the weight of the years they had spent apart. Maybe, just maybe, love deserved a second chance. In that moment, all the uncertainty, all the fear, all the pain from the past seemed to fade into the background. There was only the two of them, standing together in the garden, their hearts open in a way they hadn't been in years. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about understanding that the past had shaped them. But it didn't have to define them. They were no longer the people they had been when they first fell in love. They were different now, better in some ways, but still bound by a connection that had never fully gone away. As the evening sky shifted from hues of pink to deep blue, they stood together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The future was unknown, but it was theirs to write, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them was afraid to see where the story would lead. Together, they would rewrite the narrative of their love, creating a new chapter, one that was theirs to shape.